Thank you so much to all, and thank you, Joaquim, for the kind invitation, and of course, to the Vatican for the kind invitation. So if we can share the slides, please. Okay, so my presentation, as it was mentioned, will look at different combination of drivers, but trying to focus on the short term, but the potential implications in the medium and in the long term. So as all of you know, the key drivers that are explaining, this was done using panel data for a series of years and countries, are conflict, which is normally ranked first in terms of the frequency of countries that are in food insecurity because of the presence of conflict. Second is slowdowns and downturns, and this year there is a little change in the ranking, and I will explain that later. And the third one is climate variability and climate change. And there are 4 dimensions in which climate affects food insecurity. The first one is extreme temperatures. The second one is excess of lack of water. The third one is variability of the climate indicators, which makes more difficult to make decisions. And the fourth one is pests and diseases that will be evolving as a consequence of climate change. Now, underlying all this, we have significant increase in extreme poverty, and also significant increase in inequality, especially after COVID-19. Now, this is a graph of, in real terms, the prices of grains, fertilizer, and energy, updated up to March 2023. As you can see, if we look at the blue line, the light blue line, the situation that we are facing today in real terms is not necessarily the worst that we have faced before. In 2011, we'll have higher prices, and especially in 2007, 2008, the prices were higher. Even we also have higher prices of fertilizers, and also higher prices of energy. So we need to contextualize this. But the problem, and what I will explain during today, is that we are facing the current situation in a condition which financially is more complex for most of the countries that are the most vulnerable. And that's put a significant problem in the exacerbation of the way in which they procure food and they have access to food. The Russian invasion, so the war in Ukraine, of course, created an exacerbation, but the prices were already going up even before the war in Ukraine, and that was because of the boost of the recovery of the COVID-19. Now, despite prices are falling lately in the last 12 months, this month of April, we saw an increase of 0.6% according to the FAO Food Price Index after 12 months of decline. That 0.6 is mostly because of one commodity, but not because of cereals, but it's also reflecting a potential increase in the price of rice. But despite this decline, one of the major problems that we are facing is food inflation. And this is a table that is supplied from the IMF data, but from the World Bank, where basically you look at the evolution of food inflation in the top, the heat map, and in the right-hand side, the map in terms of real food inflation. And as you can see, the food inflation has been significant in the most vulnerable countries. There are significant tight exceptions, like the case of Argentina in South America and some other countries. But when we move into real terms, again, we see significant food inflation in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Europe, and in Andean countries, showing that we are facing significant challenges. In the bottom table, you see that many of the proportion of nominal food inflation is enormous in some countries like Lebanon, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, Turkey, and so on. What this tells us is that the transmission of prices of cereals into commodities of end consumption not necessarily is yet happening, and we are not yet absorbing those changes and those reduction in prices, which brings an enormous challenge of food insecurity to the world. Now, why the war affected the world market? The reason is simple. The cereal market is highly concentrated in terms of exports, and Ukraine and Russian Federation represent around 30% of the cereals in the world. This has resulted now, if you look in the bottom graphs, that the projected exports for 2022 for Ukraine has significantly shrunk. We look at wheat, where Ukraine was before the 6th country in terms of importance. If we look at barley, also they are significantly shrink. If we look at maize, they are not so much shrink, but they are shrink. Rapeseed also, and sunflower also has reduced. In the beginning of the war, the major challenge was for countries that were fully import dependent of these two countries, of Russian Federation and Ukraine, and especially of Ukraine. And in this graph, I have put in red the sub-Saharan African countries, the African countries, and Northern African countries, where you can see that in some countries, even in the case of Eritrea, 100% of the food came from, of the wheat came from Ukraine and Russian Federation. The same for Somalia, significant proportions. Although the amounts in absolute levels were small, they were significantly higher in the dependency, and they have no other trader partners, which didn't allow them at the beginning to be able to get the grain they needed in the time. That's why at the beginning of the war, there was this exacerbation, because they didn't have already arrangements and diversification of arrangement with other trading partners. In the stars, you see the countries which are in different levels of food crisis. And as you can see, many of the countries that were dependent were also in crisis already, which exacerbates even more the situation for this country. Now, the projections of the effects of the war in the exports from Ukraine are significant. If you look at the last column, that will be the exports adjusted, 10 million metric tons of wheat and 15 million metric tons of maize, relative to 28 to 18 million metric tons that were initially projected. That means that there already has been a significant reduction in what is being exported to the world, but there has been some supply response by other countries, especially Canada, which have recovered from the drought, and other countries which have already released stocks, like the case of India, which have coped with this, which have led to a situation where the gap in the exports is mostly covered at this point, unless, of course, the residual exports still pending coming out from Ukraine cannot be moved out because of the non-renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And this is what I'm trying to show in this graph. On the left-hand side, you have our previous estimate. In the right-hand side, you have the adjusted estimate for the lower exports. In the orange is the remaining July to June 23, the remaining from July to June 2023. As you can see, the yellow or the light orange color, the remaining and the residual is very small. So most of it has gone out. Up to now, we have 29 million metric tons that has come through the Black Sea Initiative as of today. That means that significant amount of the grain is already out, of course, controlled by the reduction in supply and in exports in Ukraine, which means that no matter, for example, there is a non-renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, in the short term, there will be a spike of prices, but the effect will be short in the short term. The problem is what will happen with the next season and the exports from the next season. That's why it's so important to renew the Black Sea Initiative. But in the short term, the impact could be small, but the concern is for the next harvest and how we can move that grain out of the harvest. And that's why it's so important to do that. Now, another element that is important is export restrictions. This is a graph done by David Laborde. Essentially, what he does here, in the vertical axis, you have the calories being traded. In the horizontal axis, you have the weeks since the shock. As you can see, the red line, which is the Ukraine or the war in Ukraine crisis, there were significant export restrictions in the first weeks up to week number 18, which were even higher than the 2007-2008 prices, and then they start to reduce around week 29 and keep at a high level, but not at the level that they were, for example, in the food price crisis. In the right-hand side, you see the evolution of the number of countries. And there again, we see that there was a significant number of countries putting export restrictions, and now it has reduced, but it's still a lot higher, of course, than COVID-19, where they were minimum only at the beginning, the little spike at the beginning. If we look at the decomposition by type of grain, we see that the problem is still in wheat, but we also see a rising problem in rice, the blue share here in terms of export restrictions. And that's something that we need to look very carefully, because if we have an increase in prices of rice, which we are observing now because of the reduction in the area planted as a result of the increase in the cost of the inputs, rice is the first commodity, so the first importer of rice in the world is Africa. So that could put significant concerns in food security in Africa, and any increase in export restriction, given how thin is this market, will create significant problems. So we need to follow this very carefully. Why is this so important? Because there is a high correlation between, in our case, the FAO Food Price Index, the blue line, and the export restrictions. So they move. As you put more restrictions, of course, prices go up, and that's something that we need to avoid, especially in the period that we are living today. Now, the consequence of all this is an increase in the food import bill. And the food import bill has increased dramatically. This is for the world, but if we just focus on the most vulnerable 62 countries, we are talking in 2022 of an increase on $25 billion for the 62 most vulnerable countries. That means that we have to be extremely careful, because most of these vulnerable countries are facing debt stress today and are facing significant challenges, and therefore we need to see how we can support them with the liquidity they need to be able to compensate for this loss in the food import bill. A second driver, which is affecting 2023 mostly, is the exchange rate devaluation, which is another tool that increases the cost of the imports, because if you're a net importer, you have to buy dollars to be able to buy food. And if the currency devaluates because you don't have a solid macroeconomic situation, so it varies country by country, then of course your food import bill will increase. So the policies being put to reduce inflation in the North countries is of course affecting the exchange rate of countries, and that is affecting also the import bill. And in addition to this, we have the debt distress that more than 40 countries are in substantial risk of going into debt distress, which makes it even more difficult. So the macroeconomic linkages to the macroeconomic side is very important. Now, the input prices has also been another consequence that has exacerbated even more with the war in Ukraine. We have seen an improvement in the reduction of the cost of urea, but still, despite the fall also in the price of gas, of natural gas, we still have prices which are close to 2 to 2.5 times more. They went up to 4 times more, but now they are 2 to 2.5. This, of course, is because Russian Federation was the first exporter of nitrogen fertilizer, the third of P, and the second of K, of potassium. Now, the consequence, as in the case of the food import bill, is, of course, a significant increase of the input import bill, so nearly 50% in 2022. Again, countries which are vulnerable are being affected on the food prices on one side, and also are being affected in the input prices, which put them in a tight situation. The overall outcome in 2021 was, our estimation was between 702 and 828 million people in chronic undernourishment. In the left-hand side, you have the projections of extreme poverty, and despite we were expecting a recovery from COVID-19 since 2020, this recovery has slowed down, and that's why you have the red dotted line, which deviates from the orange line. And in terms of acute food insecurity, in our report on 2022, we have 222 million people in acute food insecurity. The latest report now, for a bigger number of countries, is 258 million people. It's important to notice that we have more countries, and therefore we have more population. And that's why also the number goes up. But to have more countries, we need to understand why we have more countries. And part of those new countries are because of migration, and they come from mostly Latin America and some other countries because of migratory problems. But if we look within those countries, the challenge here in the ones that we have IPC information is that we have 0.38 million people in catastrophe, which is terrible. These people are dying because of lack of food. 35 million people in emergency, IPC phase 4, and 143.7 million people in IPC phase 3. So any additional shock or stress could make this extremely dramatic, and that's something that we need to carefully look at and carefully assess. The last item is the importance of increasing inequality. And what you have here in the yellow line, and between the yellow and the blue line, is the income loss due to COVID-19. And this is for the different quantiles, and as you can see, there is a significant area under the poorest quantiles relative to the richest quantiles. So COVID-19 clearly has exacerbated the situation of inequality in the world, and that's something that could create a problem of in-depth in terms of potential poverty traps and make it more difficult to recover from the situation of the crisis. And that, of course, has a correlate also in the increase on acute food insecurity, and we are seeing significant increase in the most vulnerable countries on acute food insecurity, and also, of course, in our measure of FIES, which is the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, but later it will be presented. But on acute food insecurity, we are seeing in the most vulnerable countries a significant increase that we need to look at. Now, to finalize, let me put this in the context of what we are facing today and how this will affect medium and short term. So first, we need to understand that the agri-food systems operate in risk and uncertainty. We need to understand that there are 3 dimensions that are now completely interlinked. Humanitarian, because it will affect through migration, it will affect, of course, through acute food insecurity and potential exacerbation and interlinkages with conflict, as I mentioned before. And that needs to be resolved as soon as possible, and that's where the immediate assistance is essential. The second group is the macroeconomic linkages. We knew that energy was linked through biofuels. We now know that it's also linked through the production of inputs. But we also have seen the problem of debt and debt distress and exchange rates that are something that countries cannot control, and is affecting them by policies being imposed to reduce inflation in countries that did a mistake and overshoot too much their recovery plans. And now, as a consequence of that, they keep increasing their interest rates, and that is affecting, of course, exchange rate of countries which are weak. macroeconomically. And last, we have the problem of landmines, of contamination of land, which is seriously affecting production in Ukraine, but also potential risk of nuclear contamination. On food and agriculture, we know the input side, the trade side, I already presented. Also, the logistical side has been extremely important. That will affect production, that will affect prices, but also diseases needs to be taken into consideration. And all this under water stress and climate change. So finally, two things that we believe are extremely important that we need to look at, and it's increasing resilience. And there are two components that we need to look. First is minimize risk, and the second component is to cope with risk when they occur, capacity of absorption. On the first one, we need first to have early warning systems, capacity of absorption in terms of diversification of where I import from and what I produce, and also stocks to be able to cope with emergencies. The One Health approach to avoid zoonotic reservoirs to continue, like what happened in COVID-19, and increase access to insurance. And here, a huge area of innovation needs to happen to reduce the cost of insurance and also to bring up the concept again of catastrophic insurance. In terms of coping, once the shock occurs, social protection programs need to improve. We saw during COVID-19 that Latin America, that has very solid social protection programs, were able to avoid a huge reduction of the GDP by an increase in poverty by the presence of social protection programs. We need to find ways to scale that up into African countries and most vulnerable countries. We need to prioritize investments. There is a lot of work that needs to be done. And we need to, of course, a quick win is to reduce food loss and waste, where 30% of the food loss or waste. The repurposing of incentives will be also important in the medium and long term, because today, most of the support to agriculture is creating distortions rather than to be targeted to improve our environment and to increase access to healthy diet. And finally, it's important to understand that given the context of today, trade is a requirement. There is no way we will achieve the access to healthy diets for the most vulnerable countries. If we look at the 9 food groups that are needed to be able to have access to healthy diets, Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is lacking in most of them. So trade will be essential while we keep improving productivity and production according to comparative advantage. But trade today, with the photograph of today, is essential, so we cannot go to radical extremes of self-sufficiency because that won't work and that will create a bigger global problem. Thank you so much, and sorry I went a little bit over.
Thank you.